Welcome to Sage Women, the podcast where wisdom meets empowerment. I'm Melanie White, your host, and I invite you to join us for inspiring stories and evidence-based insights that support women's health. From expert advice to real-life experiences, we'll help you to thrive through menopause and beyond. And remember to hit the subscribe button so that you get the latest updates every fortnight. Hi again, it's Melanie White on the Sage Women podcast. I'm really pleased to introduce a previous guest, Sarah Mackay, neuroscientist, talking about the social brain and women's health. Sarah, thanks so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you for the invitation back again.
I'd noticed in one of your newsletters that you said you had quite a passion for teaching and talking about the social brain. So maybe we can kick off by saying, what is that? What does that actually mean?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. So I guess over the years, I've done a lot of work on sort of brain development in different life stages. I've taken lots of looks at women's health, and this sort of one idea that keeps coming up time and time again is the importance of other people. It's one of the strongest predictors of health. I think we often fail to consider the social determinants of health, whether that be mental health, whether that be brain aging, development, just sort of overall physical robustness, resilience, etc. And so much of that is wrapped up in relationships and the relationships we have with other people, all of the biggest sort of changes that we see taking place, particularly in the female brain through the lifespan, particularly if we look at stages of puberty and adolescence and then pregnancy and motherhood. Again, the biggest changes and reorganization that we see are in sort of the social brain networks. And so I'm kind of really interested in that whole space and keeping an eye on what's happening in social neuroscience. And I suppose when we say the social brain, that's quite a big question, because when I'm a neuroscientist and we always like to break things down so we can define them and then discuss them and then test them and measure them and kind of examine them. And when I think about the social brain, there's actually kind of three, I suppose, stages of information processing, or three things that the brain is doing. So the brain is kind of perceiving, it's seeing and it's hearing and it's feeling and it's smelling and it's tasting other people. So whether that's other people's facial expressions or voice or body movement, or we are holding a newborn baby in our arms and smelling them in, those kind of the sensory perceptions that we have, and the brain is receiving that information. And then we have social cognition. So that is that kind of meaning that our brain is making of what it senses. So that includes concepts that some people may be familiar with, like theory of mind. So thinking about what other people are thinking, empathy, kind of having an awareness of what other people are feeling and that it may be different from our own emotional state, maybe social or moral judgments, other social emotions, which might be things like envy or perhaps embarrassment or shame. These are all emotions which depend on social interactions. So we've got the perception, we've got the cognition, and then we've kind of got the behavior, or our relationships and our responses with other people, how we then behave in ways and interact with other people. So I kind of think within social neuroscience, these are sort of different stages, and neuroscience kind of looks at all of those and gives us some really interesting and cool insights into human behavior based on the social brain. We can then, I always find it, I suppose, it's interesting to think about how the brain works versus where is the social brain, like which part of the brain does that, because people get quite caught up in the idea of there is one part of the brain that does this, and there's another part of the brain that does that, and another part of the brain that does that. But essentially what the brain is more like a series of kind of hubs and nodes and networks, and it's more like an internet than it is like a kind of a machine with cogs and wheels. Okay. So it's more about how does the brain do all of these things, which I think is important and interesting and insightful. It can give us, this kind of cool lens into human behavior.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me. If I were to simplify, there's three stages. It's what we sense and hear and feel at an initial awareness of what's going on, and then there's our interpretation of that, and perhaps mind reading other people or being
Mm,
socially aware, social intelligence, emotional intelligence, and that's how we behave and the relationships we form.
mm,
And as you're talking, I thought of that joke about thinking about the difference between women and men. There's a joke that a man asks a woman on a date and he doesn't think about it for the rest of the week. But during those few days, she's thinking, what did he mean when he said it like that? How did he say it? What
mm,
if we got together? What if we got married? What would our kids be like?
mm,
Oh,
mm,
maybe it would end in a messy divorce. And she ends up, she's
mm,
actually thought herself through the
mm,
whole relationship and decides to cancel the date because
mm,
she's overthought the whole thing. And I'm
mm.
whether that's true or not, I'm just thinking about how women's brains might be different from men's brains in that social connection and relationships sphere.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think we have to be really careful and thoughtful when we start approaching sex differences. And there's a lot of new neuroscience in this space, which I think has been pretty informative. For a long time, when we studied brains, and this is when we're looking at the social brain or brains in general, we were kind of limited by the data that we had at hand. So you might have a research lab that's got 20 people in and maybe 10 males and 10 females. We've scanned their brain and we've had a look at what we can see and how it's working. When you've got really low numbers, it's hard to make any
Yeah.
inferences. It's hard to pick up really when you've got really small data signals emerging. If you haven't got a big data set, it's hard to see anything. But now we're getting this emergence of data sharing and biobanks of data, and we're able to we've got data sets of maybe 100,000 brain images, and we know every single detail about that person. For a very, very long time, we had a whole lot more information about whether someone was left-handed or right-handed than we did about whether they were even male or female.
Wow.
So now we're getting a whole lot more data and we're starting to see signals emerge. But the paper that before we kind of get into how might there be differences in the social brain and all of those different stages of processing, and probably that they're less than what a lot of people might imagine, um, is to if we're even going to start talking about sex differences, we need to be pretty careful. So there's biological sex, of course, which is kind of a constellation of everything from genes to genitals to hormones to other aspects of biology. And then we've got the experiences that we have being a male or a female as we move through the world from birth and how our parents interact with us through to, you know, what we might call gender, like your perception of your biological sex, how you're educated, work opportunities, healthcare access, whether which sort of stage of life you're at. And a study came out a couple of years ago, and it's been replicated in an interesting way recently, where they looked at male and female brain anatomy from lots and lots of different data sets around the world. And they were able to kind of you can give countries like a gender equality score, a metric
Mm.
based on, access to education, access to, meaningful work, financial stability, independence, etc., etc. And so, like the Nordic countries, like say Sweden would always score very high on that, and places like India and Brazil would score much lower on that. And what was interesting was when they compared the brain anatomy of males and females, and these people were all in about their 30s, so early midlife, there was a very strong correlation with gender equality in a country, whereby in countries where there was more gender equality, males and females had equal opportunities from childhood through, brains were more similar. And when we looked at countries where there was greater gender inequality, where males and females didn't have the same opportunities growing up, whether that be access to education or employment or less stress, because of those things, the brains were more different. And it was the females' brains that actually were different. The males were pretty similar everywhere. It was the
Mm.
females' brains that varied. So
Wow.
even if we're to say males are like this and females are like that, well, first of all, we have to sort of think about, well, where in the world what data set are we looking at?
Yeah. Yeah.
What age and stage are we looking at? We know that brains change. The biggest sort of after childhood and adolescence, the biggest sort of plastic change your brain goes through is during the first pregnancy, obviously
Mm.
in the mum and the female. Um, So we could look at the brain of a 35-year-old woman in India who's had 5 kids and compare her to the brain of an 18-year-old male living in the US who's going off to Harvard to study engineering. I mean, they're very different life experiences already.
Mm.
And then compare that to someone who's 75 and perhaps with early onset Alzheimer's and is in aged care. So biological sex isn't the only difference there. There's all of their life experiences wrapped around that woman, and man, which are informing that gender equality and brain difference study was recently and fascinatingly replicated in the US, and they looked at people over the age of 65, and they were looking at different states in the US, and again they kind of ranked them looking back to when the people over the age of 65 were kind of in their sort of childhood years. So as far back as kind of 1925 up into the 1960s. And I think it was Connecticut had the highest gender equality. And I don't know whether it was Louisiana or Mississippi, one of those southern states that had the greatest gender inequality. And male and female brains were more different in the states with less equality, and they were more similar in the states with more equality. So we've seen that now replicated. So to assume that simply because you are a female, you will respond in a certain way, and you are a male, you will respond in another way, is kind of way oversimplifying what we're now starting to see the data showing. It's a whole lot more factors. It's a whole lot more complicated than that, and that's hardly a surprise because, of course, the brain is shaped and sculpted by life experiences. You've got kids who have a really terrible start to life. They come from an incredibly dysfunctional, disruptive family, and then you've got kids that grow up in like great, stable, warm, loving, like the perfect kind of family environment that you can imagine. And we can clearly see the trajectory of their brain development diverging. And once they hit puberty, it diverges even more. So although puberty is a really useful kind of time to intervene because the brain becomes very plastic again. So to simply think, oh, well, males are this and females are that is kind of missing the point. So when it then comes to the social brain, we need to then take all of that into account, and then realize that the social brain is processing the information coming in, how it's making meaning of that, and how a male might think versus a female might think. It is so hard in a human to tease that out from biology, from life experiences. It is almost impossible to do so in a human. That's why we like neuroscientists, we like looking at lab animals. We can look at rats and mice because they don't overthink. They don't have gendered experiences. We can pretty much control for all of the variables except biological sex and just get at that.
That's a great answer. It's really a multifaceted issue or concern, I suppose. And then zooming into those stages of life that you mentioned, because obviously for women's health, it's important that we close some of the data gaps and we understand what's happening at different stages of women's life. You mentioned just now that adolescence is one of those times where the brain becomes more plastic, I think you said. What are those stages in life where the brain is more plastic and where we maybe have an opportunity to make some positive changes?
Yeah. Well, the brain isn't one thing. It's lots kind of different things going on in there. So different parts of the brain or different brain networks that are involved with different types of functions or skills or have different jobs will be kind of going through different stages or becoming more or less plastic at different sort of phases in life. So one kind of very simple way to think about this is to think, well, the brain kind of develops from the back to the front. And if we think about what happens at the very back part of the brain, what we call the occipital lobe is actually involved with vision. So one of the very first parts of the brain to kind of go through phases of development is the visual cortex. And if you think about once you open your eyes, it doesn't matter whether you're a baby male or a baby female. I mean, you're going to see the world, the same buildings and trees, and you're not really having sex difference experiences in what you kind of see. I mean, there might be some tiny minor ones, but nothing that's determines the wiring up. I mean, it's lines and edges and light and dark and things that kind of guide the wiring of that very first back of the brain. And that kind of, because it's very plastic initially, and then that kind of closes down quite quickly, because we don't want the visual cortex to be constantly reorganized and rewired and patterned. We want it to actually just get down to the business of helping you see what you need to see so you can navigate through the world. And then as we kind of move a little bit further forward, we've got brain structures which are involved with things like moving our limbs, our core kind of muscles which are responding to gravity. And so the brain is receiving messages about, the body's response to gravity. I mean, that's going to be the same everywhere in the world, right? And then we've got things like our, the next parts that kind of become more plastic are our language centers in our brain. And we all know, like, even if you've never heard this concept before, you would know that brain plasticity and language centers opens and closes early, because you learn the language that you get spoken to at home. And some people are lucky enough to have 2 or even 3 languages spoken to them when they're an infant and in early childhood. You just learn that passively. You just kind of learn it by default. You learn it just by interacting with the people around you. You don't need to learn the skill. You don't need to study grammar. You don't need to learn vocab, etc., which is what you need to do to learn a language much later in life. And that's because those language centers kind of open and close. And we know that they are really important. And that's a really, what we call a critical period of plasticity in language, because if you were born deaf, that was not picked up, and there was only spoken language in your house. If you say you were given a cochlear implant later in life, it's still really hard for you to kind of get those language skills up to scratch. And a lot of the social interaction and social norms that kind of come from those early interactions. And then as we kind of move further forward in the brain, we've got parts of the brain involved with social cognition. We've got parts of the brain involved with much more higher order cognitive tasks like planning and judgment and reasoning, and even more complicated cognitive skills like being able to do maths and to be able to analyze a written text and write an essay and read and analyze and critique. Those are the sorts of skills that we see emerging during late childhood and into adolescence. A lot of the stuff that's taught in schools, it is so much easier for a young person to be taught calculus when their brain is in that plastic state than when I can't even remember anything anymore. I could kind of maybe scrabble through and figure some stuff out, but I highly doubt it. The social brain is a particularly important part of the brain that and that becomes again very plastic. Once kids kind of get into adolescence, there's actually puberty that kicks this off. And you often hear, again, this is one of these kind of little stories which has taken hold, that male brains are much slower to develop than female brains, and teenage girls' brains are more developed than boys. Well, on average, that might be the case, but that's because brain development during adolescence depends on pubertal stage. It doesn't depend on chronological age. It is driven by the hormones of puberty. It doesn't matter whether it's the male hormones or the female hormones. The female brain goes through its adolescent brain development because the pubertal hormones trigger that, and the male brain goes through that male pubertal development because the male hormones trigger that, and they kind of end up in the same point on the other side, but it's that sex hormone driven development. So if you could have a girl who goes through puberty very late, much later than her friends, and a boy who goes through puberty very early, and his brain is going to be more developed than hers because it's pubertal stage, not chronological age. An enormous part of that kind of pubertal adolescent brain development is in the social brain networks. So those parts of the brain which have evolved to perceive other people, to make meaning of that, and then to guide behavior. And that's really quite neat when you think about what's kind of the evolutionary drive that we see particularly all young mammals go through, is that, home and family and mum and dad are the center until they kind of hit puberty, and then there's this social shift, there's this reorientation away from family towards kind of finding your tribe and figuring out who you are in the world as an independent person. And the social brain needs the social interaction to guide that development. So it becomes very, very plastic, and that is great because young people are driven to be with others, and that's what motivates them. But they're also incredibly vulnerable to what do other people think about me? What do other people feel about me? And those brains are just kind of learning those social skills. Mm-hmm. And to learn those social skills, you have to make lots of mistakes. You have to it's like learning to speak, or it's like learning to walk. you trip and you fall and you pick yourself up and you have another go. And that's kind of what that social brain phase is doing through adolescence.
Mm. That's really interesting, and it makes so much sense from a biological perspective of leaving the nest and finding
Yeah.
your place in the world and who am I and what's my
Mm.
role, and then looking for a partner, reproduction, of course. And
Yeah.
are there other stages in life where we go through that where something is triggered? Because you're just talking about a hormonally driven trigger for
Mm.
brain changes and plasticity. And that immediately makes me think about, for women, we've got menarche, um, maternity, and menopause. But are
Mm.
there other stages in life that we
Mm.
see those sorts of changes?
Well, the biggest change that we see that we understand, we don't know, we hardly know anything about menopause. We know even less about people clump together perimenopause and menopause.
Mm.
Um, Perimenopause, people seem to think now it starts in your 30s. I'm not 100% convinced that's the case for most. But we don't really know much about what's going on there yet, because we've got like one or two studies looking at what happens to the brain. It's much easier to study. We've got longitudinal studies looking at childhood, and they're kind of coming up into adolescence, looking at really good brain studies. The biggest cohort is called the ABCD study, which is a longitudinal study of many thousands of children in the US. And it's great because it's got so much data about these kids. But they're all kind of about 13, 14 now. So give us another 5 years and some more interesting data is going to come through about that. We've got lots more data emerging around pregnancy and motherhood. And that's the next big, doesn't happen to everyone falls pregnant, has a baby, but about 85% of women globally become mothers in that way. And that's the biggest kind of shift that we see taking place in a brain after childhood and adolescence is during that first pregnancy. And there's about a 4% volume shift in the brains of women during the course of that first pregnancy. And interestingly, a lot of that reorganization and rewiring and plasticity, the brain becomes very plastic again, takes place in social brain networks. It takes place in all of the brain, but a lot of that's around social brain processing and social cognition. And what does someone else think and feel and need, and can I perceive and make meaning of their social cues? And of course, that's not because mothers have to look after everyone in the world. That's because mothers' brains have been prepared to promote the survival of their new little baby. And it's reading those social cues from that baby. And so that's the baby's smell. And we all know what the smell of a new baby's like, especially if it's your own. It's, figuring out and having to learn very, very quickly how to make meaning of their cries, what they need, what they want. Our social brain is very, very plastic, and the more kind of flexible and responsive those brain networks are when we measure them in new mothers, the more easily they are able to learn and interpret and almost attach to that baby. And that's kind of, I guess Mother Nature has tried to prepare the mind for motherhood by making these social brain networks super responsive and flexible and almost flatten the learning curve about responding to the baby's cues. And in time, that the brain and the nervous system learn very, very quickly. And it doesn't take very long for, say, a woman who's breastfeeding, who's lactating, to hear the baby cry and she gets milk let down. That's the social brain has learned the auditory cue
Right.
of the baby and makes meaning of it and gets gets you ready to breastfeed. There's some interesting data and rats and mice, and we don't have this in humans yet, but who knows, it might turn up, whereby we know that baby mice have this really high-pitched squeak, and you can't hear a baby mouse cry, and actually adult mice can't hear a baby mouse cry either. The only mouse that can hear a baby mouse cry is a lactating female mouse, because the
Wow.
oxytocin and prolactin that she is producing as part of lactation tune her auditory cortex, and so that she is able to hear the sound of the baby mouse crying. And once she's stopped lactating, then she can't respond to that sound anymore. So that's one of these, the perception, I talked about, there's the perceiving, the seeing and the hearing and the smelling of someone else's social cues, and the baby and the mice, it's the sound of the mouse crying. Then she's able to respond and deploy the right types of maternal behaviors. And so we're only just at the early stages of learning how,
Wow.
the human female brain changes and reorganizes during pregnancy. We know a large part of the reorganization is in social brain networks. which is largely about interpreting the social cues. Does that mean, the question then always is, does that mean that women who've had a new baby are able to perceive everyone else's social cues? Maybe not necessarily. It probably doesn't matter that much. What matters is the baby. But what does matter is having someone to help you figure all of that stuff out. And that's sort of, we evolved to co-parent. We didn't evolve to parent alone. So having as many helpers in as possible to kind of support that process is pretty useful.
That's really interesting. I love the mouse example where a lactating female mouse can hear the cries of a baby, and that's such a specific wiring where obviously so complex as individuals that we have these mechanisms that are switched on and off during our lives. And I'm also curious if you have any information about something like postpartum depression, where a woman might withdraw and be less socially active. And obviously, as you mentioned, her biological priority is looking after the baby and the safety of the baby and so forth. But what happens when a woman doesn't have the social support she needs, isn't co-parenting with others? They say it takes a village to raise a child, and you don't have the village, you're isolated, or you're withdrawing intentionally because of your mental health.
Well, the number one risk factor for developing postnatal depression is lack of social support. So if we haven't, that's just a complete and utter, non-arguable fact. So it's not inevitable, but it heightens that risk so much. That doesn't mean it is the cause of postnatal depression. It's a risk factor, and we need often lots of risk factors to kind of accumulate, but that's an incredibly vulnerable point in time for any person, particularly after your first baby. You've gone through all these ridiculously enormous physical changes of pregnancy and then labor and delivery, or however the baby made its way out, which sometimes can be incredibly traumatic. You've got a new baby in your arms, and then you've got the perceptions of how you should be feeling and thinking and behaving and mothering, as well as how you actually are responding. So it's an enormous sort of psychological shift there. Your brain has been rewired completely. You've had this massive neurological shift. You've got all of this identity stuff as a new mother. You're probably lacking sleep. You're probably learning to breastfeed. Like, your entire life has been turned upside down and rolled around. And the more helpers that you have around you to support you through that, the less likely you are to succumb to depression. And there's lots and lots of kind of factors in there that predispose you to that. We've got, coming off all of those hormones of pregnancy, that enormous hormone shift. And we see this throughout life. Some women are far more sensitive to hormones and sensitive to hormone shifts. They might be more sensitive to PMS. They might be more sensitive or they didn't like being on the pill, or maybe they were more sensitive to postnatal depression. Maybe they struggled with depression when they were going through puberty. And that's not because their hormone levels are any different. It's something about their biology and their physiology makes them more sensitive to those shifts. And again, we're just really in the early stages of trying to unpack what that might be. So, you've got those women. If you have a prior history of depression or any other kind of mental health problem, again, when you're in this kind of perfect storm of vulnerability, you're going to be kind of much more vulnerable right now. And there's some really interesting, some really, really new research which is just kind of starting to come through even within the last few months, or that researchers are starting to say, hey, this is a direction that we might take these things in, particularly new motherhood. One is around these ideas of intrusive thoughts and this kind of hypervigilance. And this is particularly, again, first-time motherhood. It fades away, babies 2, 3, 4, 5. The intrusive thoughts of harm coming to your baby, whether you just become convinced they're going to fall out the window, or you're going to drop them on the floor, or they'll fall out the car, or you'll roll down the stairs, or you'll hurl them off a balcony. You just have all of these intrusive thoughts of terrible harm coming to your baby. And it's pretty much universal, that experience. And typically it fades away within the first kind of 6 to 8 weeks. If it doesn't, then it as a very strong indicator for developing some kind of anxiety disorder. And it doesn't usually happen the next time around. And there's these ideas that maybe it's to do with, again, this Mother Nature's kind of trying to ensure survival of the baby. And you're so hypervigilant and you're trying to figure this baby out. It's almost as if your mind kind of creates these worst case scenarios for you to rehearse how you're going to react and the super hypervigilant state you're in. And because it's such a universal experience, but it's been so under recognized, it's that's sort of one new space that some research has been done in. And I remember that feeling so clearly. Like I had a living room and there was a sunroom off that and there was a balcony off that, and I wouldn't even walk from the living room into the sunroom because I was convinced the baby would fall off the balcony when he was a newborn.
Wow.
And I had another friend who had an open plan living kitchen dining room, and she was too scared to walk from the kitchen into the living room into the kitchen because there was tiles on the floor. She was too scared to walk from the carpet because she was convinced her baby would splatter on the tiles.
Wow.
And those universal intrusive thoughts are very understudied.
Yeah.
The others, that's more around anxiety, if you like, you wanted to put a kind of a label or put it in a box. And the other side around postnatal depression is some really interesting new data that's come in, that's emerged from these longitudinal studies looking at brain patterns and kind of brain topography and network organization of people who go on to develop depression. And it turns out that they have a much larger, almost twice as much brain network space taken up with what we would call the salience brain network. So that's salience means what is salient, what matters, what is important. Brain networks which are involved with interpreting stuff, information from the outside world and information from my body, and trying to make meaning of that. And they've seen that even in childhood, these brain networks are expanded and in the people that go on to develop depression later on.
Right.
And so that's super interesting what the researchers are now thinking of. This is like this kind of almost neural kind of fingerprint, so to speak, or predictor almost of who will develop depression. Can we kind of identify those people before they go through a massive kind of life transformation like early motherhood? What happens to those brain networks in new mothers? That's a really, really new space that people are just sort of starting to work in. Because, of course, for years in neuroscience, no one was looking at pregnancy. No one was looking at reproductive life transitions. No one was looking at the menstrual cycle. No one was looking at hormonal shifts. No one was looking at hormone sensitivity. Unfortunately, now that these ideas are starting to emerge, like anything, a few little grabs are taken, and it's almost being turned into a everyone all of the time message, instead of some women some of the time react this way, other women some of the other time react this way. Everyone is not going to get PMS. Everyone is not going to get postnatal depression. Everyone is not going to suffer through menopause and get depressed and need hormone therapy. Some women some of the time. And what we need to do is we need to speed up with this, and science needs to be first, and the science needs to be communicated before the activism and the agendas and the storytelling fills those gaps that have been left.
Even through this whole conversation, I've had this idea that there's plenty of myths that have been circulating for a long time, even before the more recent push in women's health. And you must roll your eyes at some of the things that you hear, broad generalizations and simplifications of things where...
I don't roll my eyes. I just get frustrated because the science has been poorly communicated.
Yeah.
And there's some really great science out there, but often careful, thoughtful science that may drive, say, clinical practice guideline development, or carefully well done science takes time. And it's not always exciting. It's not as exciting as an Instagram influencer. It's not as exciting as a solution or a course or a product or a supplement. There's this business around women's health. Because there's been this gap. Whenever there's a gap, everyone just rushes to fill it. And the science is often slow because it's having to be done thoughtfully and carefully. And there are so many amazing neuroscientists, and most of them are women working in this women's health space. And I speak to them all the time. And so many of them are so cautious and so careful, particularly in the US at the moment with the current climate over there. Oh my goodness. They are really cautious 10 years ago, everyone would agree to chat to me on the phone or Zoom or be interviewed or whatever. Now people are so cautious. They don't respond to emails, or they take a lot of time and they're really careful, and we have to go back to them. We have to double check their quotes, and we have, and that whole women's health space has to be approached in a really, really different way, because there's been so much agenda driven or
politicizing of
there's
messages.
politicizing, and then there's charismatic messaging which takes off, and then when the scientists come along and go, well, actually what we've found is something a little bit more complicated and nuanced, and it's this, and and people just aren't interested, and then the scientists are doing the work, but it takes time to do really careful, thoughtful work, and it has to be communicated very, very carefully and thoughtfully as well, and that's just no fun.
Except for the scientists. And
Well,
hopefully
it's not fun for them because their messaging isn't getting out there. So, there's some of us that are trying. Well, I consider myself to be a scientist and science communicator first, and that I don't have an agenda. I'm not trying to fulfill an activist goal. I'm really just here to talk about what's the current state of play in this space, and how can we have a science-first approach to women's health.
Yeah, and as you said, we're all individual. We all have a unique experience, and there are a multitude of factors that affect our experience, from our genetics to our environment to our social context to our aging process, our hormonal shifts. There's so many, how we identify as a person, as a gender, how busy we are, how many children we have and when. And it really is looking at somebody's whole life and saying, what are the factors that make up that person and their response?
100%. And all of those factors determine a mental health outcome or well-being outcome, and all of those factors determine brain aging, and all of those factors determine overall health, and risks for everything from heart disease to mortality to Alzheimer's disease to depression. But I suppose the other thing that I'm really cautious about, and I understand that there's gaps in women's health research, but it drives me bonkers, is that whenever men talk about men's health and men's neuroscience, men's health through the neuroscience lens, it's about peak performance and longevity and biohacking, and how can I be like 1% better than I already am. And women, it's the starting point seems to be that we're broken because we have a female brain with some hormones, and it's always about instability or dysfunction or decline or brain fog or PMS or depression or anxiety, and there's never any conversation about the strengths. It's as if men got all of that and we got nothing. And I understand that that's partly due to the gaps, but there is some really positive stories coming out of the neuroscience research, and I want those to also be shared, and I want women to not feel like they're starting from a base of brokenness simply because of their brain.
I love the way you just described that, because we do ask the question, what's wrong with me, rather than what's right with me, what's good about me. And we definitely need to have more of that focus. Sarah,
the coaches would call it a strengths-based
approach
versus, it's more like what's the positive psychology versus the clinical psychiatry kind of space. And so that's what I want to recognize, the gaps, but also like there's some really cool work out there, and there's really exciting, positive, fun research. And like if the men can talk about performance and longevity and doing well, and how can they be happier and healthier and better, why can't we also do that? It's not about ice baths either, like the ice bath boys think. It's a whole lot more.
Absolutely. We have to look at the whole person and the opportunities. Sarah, thank you for your time today. I wonder if we can wrap up this session with maybe an important message that you would like to share to people listening to this podcast, who will probably be mainly women, but just in terms of the social brain and women, is there something that you would really like to get across to listeners today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the social determinants of health are right up there, almost number one a lot of the time. And I think that we often think that all of the ways that we can better ourselves involves a lot of navel gazing and kind of stuff to do with self, and really actually it's to do with community and connection, and we know that's where the greatest opportunities lie at any stage, life stage or age, and also it's where the vulnerabilities are as well, and where people will slip through the cracks because of the lack of social support. So that's kind of number one.
That's a great takeaway. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate your knowledge and wisdom and helping to dispel a few of the myths along the way as well. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
See you soon.
Yeah.